I've been managing a small warehouse for a tech startup for about 3 years now. It's nothing big, just a quiet little building tucked between two auto shops on a dead-end road. From the outside, you'd never guess it was a warehouse. We don't ship anything major, just our own equipment, in and out. That's why the night shift usually only needs one person. Most nights, it's peaceful. I use the downtime to catch up on paperwork, shipment logs, inventory reports, the usual stuff. But one night not long ago, things started to take a strange turn. It was raining hard that night. The kind of rain that comes down in sheets and turns the whole parking lot into a mirror. I was in the back office with a warm cup of coffee and a stack of delivery sheets when I heard something. Not from inside, but from the front entrance. A dull, steady thumping. I paused, stood up, and walked across the dim warehouse floor. Through the glass doors, I saw 3 men standing outside. All 3 were soaked to the bone. One of them was pressing both hands against the door while the others loomed behind him, swaying slightly like they were having trouble staying upright. The one in front slammed his palm against the glass and cupped his hands around his face to look inside. "Hey, open up, man." I stood firm a few feet away and motioned toward the sign taped to the inside. "No public access. We're closed. You need to leave," I said clearly. One of the others stepped forward, eyes squinting through the rain. "Just let us wait out the rain, bro. We're not gonna do anything. Go home," I said. "You're not coming in." There was a moment of stillness. Then one of them, the one who had shouted first, kicked the bottom of the door in frustration. But they all turned and stumbled off into the dark parking lot. I waited a minute, just watching, then went back to work. Probably just 3 drunk guys caught in the storm. The next night they came again. No rain this time, just a heavy sky thick with clouds. I was logging shipment confirmations when I heard a knock. There they were again, standing in front of the glass doors. Silent this time, just standing and staring. I didn't even approach the entrance. I stepped out into the open so they could see me, pointed at the sign again, and crossed my arms. They didn't yell, didn't kick the door this time either. They just stared for a while and walked away. On the 3rd night, the clouds still hung low over the building. No rain, but it felt like it could fall any minute. They returned once more. Same time, same place, same cold silence. This time I stepped closer to the door and raised my voice. "If you come here again, there's going to be a problem. Leave now." They didn't argue. They didn't speak at all. They just turned and walked off. For a few days after that, everything was quiet again. I figured they'd finally gotten the message. But a week later, just after midnight, I heard something different. It wasn't a knock. It was a solid thud, a sound that echoed just slightly through the back end of the building. I stood up, grabbed a flashlight, and made my way toward the loading dock. Nothing inside was out of place. No fallen crates, no scattered boxes. But then I looked at the back door. It was metal, solid, no windows. I walked up to it and checked the handle. Still locked, but something told me someone had been there, listening. I decided to check the camera footage from the rear lot. As manager, it was within my call. The back lot camera took a moment to load, but when it did, the footage sent a chill through me. There they were, all 3 of them, standing silently at the back door. One of them had his ear pressed against the metal. Another kept lightly trying the handle. The third just stood a few feet back, still and distant, as if he wasn't really with the others at all. Enough was enough. I wasn't about to let this go on any longer. I called in 2 of my day shift workers who lived nearby and could be trusted. They were quick to respond when I explained the situation. When they arrived, I didn't waste time. It was raining again by then, not as heavy as that first night, but enough to drench your jacket in a minute. We moved around the outside of the building in silence. Under the yellow security lights, we crossed the back lot. And just like before, there they were, the 3 of them, huddled near the back entrance, not noticing us until we were nearly on top of them. "Hey!" I shouted. They spun around, startled. Two of them bolted immediately, slipping on the wet concrete as they ran off into the night. But the third wasn't quick enough. The one who'd been pressing his ear to the door. We grabbed him. One of the workers, clearly furious, gave him a hard slap. "What the hell are you doing here every night?" he demanded. The guy was drenched and smelled like stale liquor. He mumbled something, eyes darting around like he was trying to piece together where he was. "Hold it," I said, pushing the worker back. "No hitting." The drunk guy blinked slowly. Then, seeing the opening, shoved himself away from us and took off down the alley. We ran after him, but the rain made the ground slick, and he vanished between the buildings before we could catch him. We stood there in the rain for a moment, catching our breath. That was the last time I ever saw any of them. In the days that followed, I had the locks changed, reinforced the back door, and installed 2 more cameras covering every angle of the building. We haven't had a single incident since. I don't know what they wanted. Maybe it really was just shelter from the rain. Maybe it wasn't. But I do know one thing. You don't keep coming back night after night, without a word, without trying to explain, just to stay dry. I was still freshly graduated and working my first real job in the city. Some coworkers invited me to go for drinks with them on a Friday night to celebrate my first month on the team. I had an amazing time, and it was awesome to get to know them in such a casual and different environment. However, since I was only 19, I stuck to soda while everyone else went through rounds of cocktails. As the night wound down, a heavy knot formed in my stomach. My coworkers had insisted I treat them to a round of appetizers to celebrate my first paycheck. Between that and the looming deadline for my house rent, my bank account was terrifyingly low. I checked my banking app. The balance was barely enough to cover my rent, let alone a surge. Priced Uber across the city. By the time things wrapped up, I started calling around to some friends and family to see who was free to give me a ride home. I found out everyone with a car was either drunk, asleep, or both. I realized that if I was going to get home that night, I either had to hitch a ride with a total stranger or walk a heck of a long way on my own in the dark. As I couldn't afford a professional ride and I couldn't afford to lose my apartment. But the idea of the first thing scared the ever-living hell out of me. So I chose the second thing and started walking. I cannot overstate how glad I was that I chose to wear sneakers that night. The city streets were eerily quiet. About 20 minutes into the trek, a car slowed down beside me. The driver was a young man, clutching a roll of blueprints. He looked barely older than me, maybe 20. He looked harmless, almost stressed to the point of tears. "Please," he said, "I'm looking for the municipal planning office. I have a deadline, and I'm lost." I stepped closer to the curb to point the way. But as I did, the back door flew open. A woman leapt out from the back. She was well-built, maybe 45 years old, and stood a towering 5'10". She had the look of a heavy drug user with deep, dark circles that made her look like a ghost. As I tried to back away, the woman lunged at me and we crashed into each other. I didn't just run, I fought back. She swung a heavy hand at my head and I ducked. I shoved my palms into her chest to create distance. She hissed at me, grabbing a handful of my hair, and for a terrifying moment we were locked in a struggle. Realizing I couldn't outfight her, I turned and bolted toward the side of the road. There was a heavy iron window grill attached to the front of a closed basement-level shop. I dived for it, wrapping my arms through the cold metal bars and locking my fingers together in a death grip. I knew that if they couldn't pull me off, they couldn't get me into the car. The driver then hopped out of the front to help his mother, and I realized then how small he was. He was a dwarf man who looked to be only 5 feet in height. He grabbed my waist and started pulling with everything he had.
"I want her,"
he demanded, his voice high-pitched and eerie.
"Mother, I want her."
The woman joined him, her large, rough hands wrapping around my wrists, trying to pry my fingers off the iron. I screamed until my throat felt like it was bleeding, kicking backward at anyone who touched me. The woman slammed her shoulder into me to try and knock the wind out of me, but I only squeezed the metal bars tighter, the iron digging painfully into my chest. Just as my strength began to fail, a tall black man appeared from the shadows of a nearby park entrance. He didn't hesitate. He shouted at the top of his lungs, charging toward the car. He had a heavy flashlight in his hand. As he ran, his voice boomed with a protective authority that seemed to shake the pavement, making it clear he wasn't just a witness, but a guardian. The sight of him coming for help broke their resolve. The woman let go of me, first cursing under her breath, her dark circled eyes snapping toward the newcomer. The young man let out a frustrated cry, but realized they were outmatched. They scrambled back into the car, the tires screeching as they sped away into the night. The man reached me seconds later, checking to see if I was hurt. I was shaking so hard I could barely stand, but I was safe. He stayed with me, calling the police and waiting until the patrol car arrived to ensure I got home. The man spoke in a soft voice to keep me calm. He told me his name was Marcus, and he lived nearby. He gave me his jacket because I was shivering from the cold and the fear. The police arrived quickly with their bright flashing lights. I told them everything that happened while Marcus stood by my side. They took notes and searched the area for the car. I felt a huge wave of relief wash over me. I realized how lucky I was that Marcus had been there. That night changed my whole life. I never walk alone anymore. I still think about that night, and how a pair of sneakers and that iron grill were the only things that stood between me and a nightmare.
This happened a few years back when I had just been hired at a local grocery store in my city. I was 16 at the time, and definitely looked my age, if not even a bit younger. It is important to mention that I am quite a shy person by nature, and I was especially quiet back then while trying to navigate my very first workplace. I had been working there for a short while when the store hired a new cashier. For the sake of this story, I will call him Joseph. In the beginning, Joseph seemed like a perfectly nice person. He was always waving hello to the rest of the staff, and made an effort to greet everyone at the start of his shift. He seemed to fit in quite well, appearing to be just a normal guy who was trying his best to befriend his new co-workers. After Joseph had been working at the store for a few months, he started trying to talk to me more frequently. At first, this did not seem strange to me. Cashiers often get close to the people they frequently work shifts with, and it is always nice to have someone to chat with when the store gets quiet. However, things escalated rather quickly. Joseph began going out of his way to talk to me every single chance he got. I still assumed he was just being friendly, since he was relatively new to the team. This perspective changed one day, as I was finishing my shift. As I was exiting the store, Joseph approached me and asked if I would like to go out for coffee with him. I was caught completely off guard. Because I was such a shy and anxious person, I stammered out an agreement and said sure, though I immediately regretted it. I had zero attraction to Joseph. I quickly ran out of the store to where my parents were waiting to pick me up, feeling a sense of dread. When I got home that day, I searched for his profile on Facebook to see if I could find out more about him. It turned out that Joseph was not as young as I had originally assumed. He was 26 years old at the time. It was a well-known fact among the staff that I and several other cashiers were still in high school. Knowing that I was not going to entertain the idea of a date with him, I approached him the next day at work. I told him that I would not be able to get coffee with him because the age difference was simply too much for me. Unfortunately, this did not seem to deter Joseph at all. He simply dismissed my concern, telling me that age did not matter to him and asking if it really mattered to me. I tried to explain that it mattered quite a bit considering he was almost 30 and I was still a student in high school. He seemed to ignore my comment entirely, stating that he would wait for me and claiming he could make me happy. This interaction obviously creeped me out. From that point on, I began to avoid Joseph as best as I could. Despite my efforts, he became very persistent. Every single shift I had, he seemed to be there. He would even go through my checkout lane to buy a single item just so he could pester me for a date. He asked me almost daily if I had changed my mind and repeatedly told me that he was not going to give up. To some, this might not seem like much, but being harassed daily by an older man in a place where I was supposed to be safe was terrifying. I admit that if this happened today, I would go straight to HR or a manager to report the situation. However, as a 16-year-old girl at her first job, I was afraid that I was just overreacting. Eventually, after a couple of months of being genuinely scared to go to work, I finally confided in a friend I worked with. This friend was a very tall man who told me he would speak to Joseph about his creepy behavior. Around the same time, I also spoke to one of Joseph's closer friends at the store about how his behavior was upsetting me. Shortly after these conversations, Joseph began to leave me alone, and not long after that, he left the job entirely. I had actually begun to forget the entire ordeal until about a year or so ago. I received a message from an old work friend I don't talk to very often. She asked if I had seen a specific post and included a link. The link led to a mugshot from the local Crime Stoppers unit. It was a photo of Joseph. Underneath the image, it stated that there was a province-wide warrant out for his arrest. He was being charged with the possession and distribution of illicit images containing children. I do not know what I avoided by refusing that coffee date, and I cannot say for certain that something terrible would have happened that day. However, I am incredibly glad that my internal warning bells went off when they did.
I can still feel the phantom grip on my ankles even now, just a week after it happened. Before we made the move to Texas, we lived in this house in Georgia with a backyard that was basically a kid's private kingdom. 2 acres of open grass, thick woods on 3 sides. It was the ultimate spot for sports or a massive game of manhunt. It had everything: a trampoline, a hot tub, a detached garage, and an above-ground pool. For a middle-class neighborhood, we had it made. Last Friday night, my friends Mike and Michael came over for a sleepover. I'm a Boy Scout, so I spent the afternoon setting up 2 tents, while the guys mostly goofed off. After some soccer and a quick baseball game, we inhaled some pizza my parents ordered around 7 p.m. Since the sun was setting, we headed into the living room to chill for a bit. We ended up binge-watching Stranger Things. Watching Eleven deal with the Upside Down and those bad men definitely had us on edge. By the time we stepped back outside into the dark, every shadow in the Georgia woods looked like a Demogorgon. We started a game of manhunt to shake off the nerves. Mike and I were hiding first, while Michael was the hunter. I crawled under the trampoline in the far corner, near the edge of the woods. My plan was to wait for the hunter's whistle, then sneak toward the hot tub near the house so I could make a beeline for the back door. I was mid-sprint toward the hot tub when I heard a heavy thud. One of the trash bins on the side of the house nearly toppled over. Suddenly, the motion sensor light clicked on, bathing the side yard in that harsh, artificial glow. I peeked around the corner and saw him. A tall man in dark clothes, speed walking away from the light toward the woods. It definitely wasn't my dad. I called the game off instantly. My dad came out with a flashlight, but after checking the woods and the street, he found nothing.
Everyone inside tonight.
He said. We were bummed, but we went to my room and played PlayStation to distract ourselves. By midnight, we talked ourselves into being brave again. We figured the guy was long gone and we didn't want the tents I'd worked so hard on to go to waste. We snuck back out quietly. We weren't necessarily hiding it, but we didn't want to wake my dad up and start a whole thing. Mike and I zipped ourselves into one tent, and Michael took the second one. I was still awake listening to the crickets when I heard it. The distinct, rhythmic crunch of footsteps in the grass coming closer. Then, the sound of the tent zipper sliding out. The flap opened, and a face peered in. In the dark, I honestly thought my dad had caught us. They wanted to sleep out here, so we came back out, I muttered, half asleep. Then my vision cleared. The porch light was just bright enough to show that this wasn't my dad's face. It was a complete stranger, probably in his 40s, with deep-set eyes and a hollow, terrifying expression. When he realized I was looking right at him, his lips curled into a thin, tight line. He didn't say a word. He just lunged forward. I let out a scream of bloody murder that felt like it ripped my throat open. It wasn't just a shout. It was that raw, primal sound of pure survival. Mike jolted awake and, seeing the silhouette over us, started shrieking too. The man didn't back off. Instead, he dove toward the bottom of our sleeping bag. His hands, cold and rough, clamped down hard around our ankles. He yanked us toward the opening of the tent, hissing, "Quiet, be quiet," through gritted teeth. The sensation of being dragged out into the dark by a predator was the most helpless I've ever felt. I kicked frantically, my heel catching him in the chest, while Mike was flailing and screaming like a siren. The noise was deafening in the small tent. The man looked back toward the house, realized he had zero chance of staying hidden now that the whole neighborhood was awake, and suddenly let go. He backed out of the tent and vanished into the trees like a ghost. We didn't stop running until we hit the back door, our socks sliding wildly on the kitchen tile as we slammed and locked the deadbolt. My dad was already there, charging out in his boxers with a heavy maglite in one hand and a baseball bat in the other, alerted by the noise. He spent the next half hour screaming into the dark woods, his voice echoing off the trees as he taunted the guy to come back and face him, while my mom stayed in the living room with us, her hands shaking as she dialed 911. The police arrived about 10 minutes later, their blue and red lights casting long, eerie shadows across the yard, just like the scenes we had watched in Stranger Things only hours before. They took our statements, but the real chill didn't hit until the next morning. My dad and one of the officers went back out to the tent to inspect the area, nestled in the grass right behind our tent, where the man had likely been crouching and waiting for us to fall asleep. They found a small, rusted folding knife and a heavy roll of duct tape that didn't belong to us. The police kept the items as evidence, but they never made an arrest. Even though it's been only a week, I still can't go near those woods without looking for a tall figure in the shadows. I can't help but wonder how long he was standing there in the dark, watching the glow of the TV through the window, while we laughed at a fictional show, completely unaware that a real monster was waiting for the lights to go out. I am originally from Belarus, though I live in the United States now. I obtained my very first job under the table during the early to mid-1990s. At the time, I was only 12 or 13 years old. My role was to serve as a helper in my father's barbershop. My duties were simple. I spent most of my time sweeping up piles of hair, scrubbing the bathroom, taking out the trash, and handling various chores of that nature. We lived and worked in a small area located near the border with Poland. This was a pivotal era in history because Lukashenko had just ascended to power, and the Soviet Union had recently dissolved. These were incredibly difficult and dark times for everyone in the region. Mass starvation and crushing poverty swallowed the land entirely. In fact, these systemic problems still plague that area today. But I should get back to the story. I was at the barbershop with my father, whom I called Papa. We really only saw the same few regulars every week. Most people in our area chose to cut their own hair or had a family member do it. Maintaining a barbershop was actually one of the only private enterprises possible during the Soviet Union era. As the day went by, the sky began to grow dark. Papa told me to finish cleaning up and then head right home. After giving me this lecture, he left me alone in the barbershop so he could go find a place to drink by himself. I finished my chores as instructed, locked the front door, and finally began the long walk home. This was a very rural area. It wasn't exactly the deep countryside, but everything was spaced out significantly. It was hard to maintain any real sense of community there, so everyone usually stuck to themselves and valued their privacy. As I was walking along the road, I suddenly realized that I had forgotten to take out the final bag of garbage. I turned around to head back to the shop. When I turned, I noticed a Lada driving behind me. The strange thing was that it had no lights on. I believe the driver was actually coasting, as there was no audible sound of an engine humming. We were also traveling slightly downhill. Since I had reversed, I was walking uphill. The car passed me by and I felt somewhat at ease. However, when the Lada reached the bottom of the hill, the driver cranked the engine on and made a sudden U-turn. They pulled up right beside me. I could see a man and a woman sitting inside. The man driving the car called out to me, asking if I wanted a lift to wherever I was going. I told them no thanks and explained my destination was nearby. I also honestly told them that they were severely creeping me out. They became visibly offended that I had called them creepy. They began to yell at me loudly, calling me all sorts of nasty names and shouting at me. They hoped I would slip and crack my head open on the ground. Figuring they were probably just drunk and belligerent, I told them to F off. Then, I cut through the grass and trees to get off the road. I took a shortcut through a small wooded area that I knew would eventually link back to the street on the other side. I assumed that by the time I reached the exit, some time would have passed and they would be gone. Yet, when I reached the other side, the same Lada was idling on the road waiting. At this point, I was getting extremely agitated rather than scared. I came from a home with an alcoholic father and was a Slav squad kid. I was quite used to confronting aggressive adults. With my attitude, that also meant I was used to being beaten by adults. Because of this, random people acting tough didn't intimidate me much. It sounds edgy, but you get used to it. You learn to read a person to see if they're actually going to attack a child. You would be surprised by how many adults actually do. Filled with anger, I walked directly up to the car and confronted the man. I asked him why he was following me, and if he liked me or wanted a kid for some reason. I told him he should go be with the woman in the car and leave me alone. The man paused for a second and then put his hand up to the window. He was holding a gun, or at least something that looked exactly like one. It was dark, so I couldn't see perfectly. He told me that I could either have a good night or my last night. He said that if I got in the car, we could drive around and drink vodka. But if I refused, he would kill me. Ironically, while I had been in plenty of fistfights with adults before, I had never been confronted with a firearm. I didn't know exactly what to do, but I knew for certain I wasn't getting into that freak's car. I hesitated for a moment and then lied. I told him okay and said I would get in, acting as if I were going along with their plan. I walked over to the passenger side of the vehicle. The woman opened her door and got out to let me into the back seat. I believe she was about to say something patronizing like "good boy," but as she stepped out, I kicked her in the leg. I kicked as hard as I possibly could and immediately bolted. She yelped in pain and fell over. By the time they realized what had happened, I was already back in the safety of the trees. It was a circular wooded area surrounded by roads, similar to a large roundabout, which allowed me to get to the center where they couldn't see me. They had no way of knowing which side I would eventually come out on. I sat and waited in the dark center for a long time. Once I decided enough time had passed, I exited on the side nearest the barber shop. I sprinted from the woods, up the road, and straight back into the shop. I unlocked the door, jumped inside, locked it behind me, and stayed there for the entire night. In the morning, my father showed up at the shop. Instead of being relieved, he beat me for never coming home. I tried to explain the kidnapping attempt and even tried to describe the car in detail, but that only made him angrier. He accused me of lying and told me I was just using stories from the news. Unfortunately, these types of events were common back then. It wasn't an everyday occurrence for one person, but reported kidnappings had become as common as car break. In Zarin, America. It turned out these two people had gone around the entire village that day, asking any kids they saw if they wanted a lift. There were other reports of them making threats as well. After my experience, I paid very close attention to the news, in hopes of seeing that those people had been caught. Instead, I only saw headlines about more children going missing. There was a terrifying abundance of missing kids over those few months. It was widely assumed that these children had their organs harvested, were trafficked to other countries, or were even killed and eaten due to the mass starvation. Unless you were like my family or were relatively wealthy by the standards of the day, it was very likely that you didn't eat much at all. This desperation led to unspeakable horrors.
The place where I come from is quite famous. Well, a version of it. I'm from Hawkins, Texas. It is a great town, and you must have heard of it on the famous Netflix series called Stranger Things. Hawkins is a great town. We are a small town in Texas, but we have everything we need in a tightly knitted community. And unlike Stranger Things, there's nothing weird in this town. Well, at least we thought there wasn't. It was the summer of 2019. Stranger Things had already become this big thing on Netflix, and people were coming all over from the country to take a look at the town. It did give us an economic boost, but it was all over by the end of summer. Me and my girlfriend Demi were a pretty big fan of the show, and we even did the whole tour of all the places that were shown in the infamous forest. It was a very normal run for us, and we did a tour of a bus of nerds that were visiting the town. After rounding up the tours of all the locations, we decided to spend some alone time by the lake, and we dozed off for about an hour. Somewhere in between, Demi woke me up because she heard something. The voice was coming from the other side of the river. We were not scared, but this was the most late we had ever been in that forest, and the lighting outside was dimming as the night was starting to crack. We got up and decided to leave, and took the other way this time, rather than our usual river route. As we're passing by, we saw the abandoned shed warehouse, but the lights were on. It was too late to even dare to investigate, so we let it go. The next week we came back, and this time, I didn't bring Demi with me to keep her out of any possible dangerous situation. I came out on my own and decided to look into that shed-like warehouse to understand who was operating it in the middle of nowhere. And as I sneaked to take a look through window, I could see it looked like a lab setup. And before I could get more information by observing, I heard a growling sound. At first, I thought it might have been a dog, but it wasn't. There in the shed stood a 4-foot dog-like creature, more human than hound, but definitely not a dog. And it looked around as if it could smell some foreign musk. I ducked and waited for the right time to storm off. I peeked a look at one more time, and there it was, the old man with the hound, instructing it, whispering something in the ear. I stormed off, and I could feel as if the hound was chasing me. I made sure to do that as silently as possible, because even if the hound was chasing me, there was no chance that I would outrun it, so I tread silently. As soon as I got back, I straight away went to my girlfriend and told her everything that I saw, and like me, she was more excited than scared, because for us, it meant that Stranger Things was closer to reality, and that we would be able to live part of the fantasy that our town famously portrayed in the show. We were pretty excited. We went the next day in broad daylight to sneak and wait until the old man was gone as we spied from afar. As soon as he was gone, we went into the shed, not realizing that the hound could be in there and could be very dangerous. As we entered the shed, we saw that it was a fully working lab, and it was just out of Stranger Things. We carefully inspected the place, and it all seemed so real. As we were busy raving about it, all we found that we forgot about the time. It was evening, and we saw the man heading back, and we could listen to the hound. We hid in the tiny compartment, hoping to not get found, until we did. And as the man approached, we just begged for mercy, thinking that we would be found face down in a river somewhere. And as the man brought it out, there it was, the hound. The creature looks alien, and its mouth wide open. And as we got out and saw the creature, we prayed in our hearts for mercy. Moments later, the creature just stood there. It did nothing. It was then the suspicious man told us to not worry, as it was not a real creature, but the prop he made. The whole shed was a studio. He told us that he was inspired by the whole Stranger Things phenomenon, that he decided to make his film about creatures. He called it In the Night They Crawl. It was all so surreal, and we were in complete shock. The man apologized to us, and we apologized to him for breaking. He was a cool old man, didn't complain or anything. But yes, we did ended up helping him, and along with him, we geeked out making the movie with him, getting in Stranger Things action.
Last summer, I was 21 years old and enjoying a family vacation at Myrtle Beach. We were staying in a high-rise resort, positioned somewhere around the 13th or 14th floor in a timeshare unit. One particular night, restlessness took hold of me. I found myself tossing and turning, unable to find the comfort of sleep. By 3 a.m., the quiet of the room became stifling. Consequently, I decided to step out onto the balcony to breathe in some fresh night air. The sight from the balcony was breathtaking. A full moon hung in the sky, casting a brilliant, shimmering path of light across the ocean waves. Looking down, I noticed the beach was entirely deserted, a rare sight for such a popular destination. The stillness was captivating. Since sleep remained elusive, I figured a short walk on the sand might help me relax. I planned to listen to some music and clear my head, hoping that a bit of physical activity would finally make me tired enough to rest. In hindsight, it was a foolish and unsafe decision to head out alone at that hour. However, because my family was fast asleep, I chose not to wake anyone or leave a note. I rationalized the choice by telling myself I would only be gone for 10 or 15 minutes. I just wanted a quick moment of solitude before returning to bed. The base of our resort featured a pool area and an outdoor bar. Beyond that, 2 separate boardwalks, spaced about 100 feet apart, led through the tall seagrass and down to the shore. When I reached the ground level, the resort grounds were as empty as the beach had appeared from above. I chose the boardwalk on the right and began making my way toward the water. As I walked down the wooden path, a figure appeared, coming from the direction of the beach. This caught me off guard because I had just scanned that very area from my balcony and hadn't seen a single soul. My pulse quickened slightly as the person drew closer. Under the dim glow of the outdoor bar lights, I could see it was a man, likely in his late 30s. He wore a backpack and a pair of glasses with large, square frames. He looked incredibly tense and alert, scanning his surroundings as if he were searching for someone or expecting a clandestine meeting. His clothes appeared tattered and worn. As we crossed paths, we made brief eye contact. I gave him a small, polite nod and continued past him, but a wave of unease washed over me. He reminded me strangely of Jeffrey Dahmer because of those glasses, and he didn't look like someone who was staying at a high-end resort. I tried to dismiss the feeling, putting my headphones in to focus on the music. Upon reaching the sand, I turned right and began walking parallel to the ocean. I took off my shoes and moved closer to the shoreline so I could feel the cool water on my feet. I walked for about a minute, trying to enjoy the scenery. A sudden, primal instinct told me that something was wrong. I pulled my headphones down and glanced over my shoulder. A dark figure was trailing me further up the shore, positioned strategically between me and the resort. Based on the man's height and movement, I knew immediately it was the same person I had passed on the boardwalk. Panic began to set in, and my mind flooded with every horror story I had ever heard. Still, I tried to remain logical. I told myself it might just be a coincidence. Perhaps the man had simply decided to take a walk as well, and happened to be moving in the same direction. To calm my nerves, I took a few deep breaths and turned my gaze back toward the horizon, maintaining my pace. After a few more seconds, I checked again. My heart sank when I realized he had closed the gap significantly. He wasn't just walking parallel to me anymore. He was angled directly toward me. I quickened my pace, and to my horror, he immediately matched my speed, continuing his diagonal path toward the water's edge. A part of me tried to deny the reality of the situation. I thought that maybe he just preferred walking by the water and wasn't actually stalking me. Seeking to confirm my theory, I performed a complete 180-degree turn and started walking the opposite way. As I turned my head, I saw him mirror my movement perfectly. He was now power walking, aggressively closing the distance between us. The gravity of the situation finally hit me. I broke into a full run along the shoreline. He immediately began running too. He stayed higher up on the beach, cutting off my path to the resort boardwalks. If I tried to head for safety, he would be able to intercept me before I reached the stairs. With no clear plan, I simply kept running. I was young and relatively fit, so I hoped I could outlast him. I hoped I could find another exit further down the beach and eventually find a way back to the road or call for help. We ran like that for what felt like 15 minutes. The most terrifying aspect was the absolute silence of the night. There was no wind, no voices, only the sound of my own heavy breathing and the rhythmic thud of my feet hitting the wet sand. Every time I looked back, his shadowy figure was there, keeping pace and lurking in the darkness upshore. Eventually, I spotted a small, flickering blue light ahead on the sand. As I got closer, I saw a group of 4 people sitting on a blanket. They were positioned higher up on the beach. I decided to make a break for them, thinking that even if he tried to cut me off, I could reach them first. I hoped that by alerting them, we could confront the man together. I used the last of my energy to sprint toward the group. However, as I arrived, my hope vanished. The scene was one of total intoxication. There were 4 men surrounded by several large bottles of liquor. Most were empty, and the last was nearly gone. 3 of the men were completely passed out, unresponsive to the world. The 4th man was barely upright, wearing a party hat adorned with blue LED lights. He was mumbling to himself, his eyes glazed over and half closed. He didn't even notice me standing 5 feet away from him. I looked back and saw that my pursuer had slowed down. He was watching me, and I could almost see him processing the state of the group. Realizing they were no threat to him and no help to me, he suddenly began sprinting toward me again. As he entered the glow of the blue party lights, his face became clear. He looked manic, his eyes wide and fixed on me as he barreled forward at full speed. I knew I had to do something drastic. I had exhausted myself sprinting to the drunk group. I feared that, in a long-distance race, he might eventually overtake me. Instead of turning and running away from him, I suddenly lunged forward, sprinting directly toward him and then veering sharply to the right. The move caught him completely off guard. He stumbled as he tried to adjust his momentum, allowing me to slip past him. I didn't look back. I just ran with every ounce of strength I had left toward the resort. The adrenaline was overwhelming. It felt like one of those nightmares where a killer is inches away from grabbing you. Every hair on my neck was standing on end. As the resort loomed closer, I finally dared to glance over my shoulder. He was still following, but he was now 400 or 500 feet behind me. He had lost significant ground. I didn't slow down for a second. I raced up the boardwalk and burst into the resort area. I reached the elevators and pounded the buttons until the doors opened. Once inside, I frantically mashed the closed door button, gasping for air as the metal sliders finally met. When I reached my floor, I sprinted down the hallway, fumbled with my key, and practically fell into the room. I slammed the door, engaged the deadbolt, and leaned against the wood, trembling. I stayed on the floor for a long time, my chest heaving, trying to process the terror of the last 30 minutes. I eventually crawled to my bedroom, staying low to the floor because I was terrified he might be able to see me through the balcony glass from somewhere outside. Needless to say, I stayed awake until the sun came up, and I never went for a late-night walk alone again. I was a fresh-faced graduate just out of high school during that final summer before I left for the University of Texas. To make sure I had a full wallet for the small things in life, I took a construction job despite already having a full scholarship for my first 2 years of college. For the most part, the other men on the crew were friendly and entertaining. It was a rare day that passed without us being doubled over in laughter because of something someone had done or said. 2 of the workers, Mark and Daniel, were exceptionally funny and had been working together on various sites for the past 15 years. They were both top-grade practical jokers, but Mark had a tendency to take things a little too far. Daniel was most often the target of this humor, which created a constant source of tension between the two, even if they usually made up by the time we clocked out. As anyone might expect, eventually Mark's joking was going to go too far for Daniel to overlook. That specific day happened to fall during my final week on the job. For some time, everyone on the site had noticed that Daniel wasn't acting like himself. He spent long periods away from the group talking on his phone, and when he was around, he seemed constantly agitated. His usual happy-go-lucky manner had completely disappeared. We all tried our best to make him laugh, but nothing seemed to work, not even Mark's antics. As the days went on, the collective theory on the site was that his troubles involved his girlfriend. When Mark heard these rumors, he couldn't stop himself from poking at that particular sore spot. On this day, Daniel had gone off to talk on the phone again. When he returned, Mark immediately started joking around, asking Daniel what was wrong and if he was having troubles at home. Mark went as far as to suggest that Daniel's lady was seeing the mailman while he was away at work. These verbal jabs only served to annoy Daniel further. He said nothing in response, instead choosing to stare at Mark as if he were trying to burn holes through him with his eyes. Mark wasn't going to let Daniel's bad mood get in the way of getting a laugh from the rest of the crew. After lunch and throughout the remainder of the day, Mark continued with his jokes. Daniel, who was usually the type of guy to say something when he was fed up, held his tongue the entire day. I knew that if Daniel didn't put a stop to the poking soon, Mark would take things too far and cause a serious problem, perhaps even a fight. Daniel was clearly in no mood to let the remarks roll off his back. As quitting time arrived, I felt myself relax, assuming Mark would finally let up. Unfortunately, things were about to get much worse. It was finally time to head home. We were going around the site, picking up our tools and cleaning up any trash we had left behind. Everyone was focused on their own tasks. I was off in my own little world, thinking about the last-minute things I needed to accomplish before leaving for school. When the work was complete, we all stood around discussing our plans for the upcoming weekend. It had been a while since Mark had made any jokes, and I assumed he had finished for the day. When it was his turn to speak, he looked very serious and told the group that since Daniel was going fishing, he thought he would go over to Daniel's place to spend some time with his lady. The joke took all of us by complete surprise, and the crew fell over themselves laughing. Everyone laughed except for Daniel. I saw a snarl appear across his face, and his teeth were gritted so tightly it looked like they might crumble at any second. Daniel shouted that he was sick of the stupid jokes. No sooner had the words left his mouth than he stepped forward with his hammer drawn back. I was standing dangerously close to Mark at the time, and stumbled back so quickly that I fell onto my butt. I looked up just as Daniel brought the claw end of the hammer down into Mark's skull. Mark immediately fell over and began seizing, writhing around on the floor. I was in total shock and remained frozen where I was. I watched Daniel to see what his next move would be. He stood over Mark's convulsing body for a moment, simply surveying his handiwork. I felt a wave of relief when he calmly walked over to a bench and just sat down. I don't think I could have moved even if he had come at me. Just like me, the other guys were frozen in place, watching as Mark's body slowly came to a limp halt. We all looked at each other, too terrified to speak. Daniel was the one who finally broke the silence. He told us in a resigned voice that we should probably call the cops and that he wasn't going to run off because he was just a little fed up. The resignation in his voice showed just how far gone he truly was. The old Daniel I knew would never have done anything like this. We did exactly as he asked, and he didn't give the police any trouble when they arrived to take him away. I thought the shock was just affecting me in that moment, but even now, years later, I don't feel anything but sorry for Daniel. It would come out later just how bad things had been going for him at home. His girlfriend had cheated on him more than once and had blamed the entire situation on him. He had been working 2, sometimes 3 jobs just to keep her happy and keep up with their expenses. He was neck deep in love and too blind to realize what was happening until it had already occurred. After everything he did to give her what she wanted, she had the nerve to complain about him being gone at work so much. When he was on the job, all he could think about was whether she was with another man at that very moment. He was too private of a person to share any of that struggle with us. I don't think Mark had any idea what was truly occurring in Daniel's private life. He took a shot, and when he saw that he had hit a nerve, he decided to ride it into the ground. Mark did that a lot, and this turned out to be one time too many. I'm still in shock sometimes when I think about how quickly life left Mark's body during those last few convulsing moments. All of us offered to serve as character witnesses for Daniel, but it turned out not to be necessary. A deal was struck, and Daniel agreed to serve 15 years in prison. He has been offered parole in the intervening years, but has declined it every time. With his release date soon approaching, I hope he is able to get his life back together and move beyond the shadow of what I suppose you could call a crime of passion. I have saved the most important person in the story for last. Mark's story obviously ended on that job site. Some readers might wonder why Daniel received so much sympathy while Mark received so little. The truth is that although Mark was a very funny guy, that was about the only thing he had going for him. I already mentioned how far he would push Daniel with his joking. These days, people would likely call it bullying, and I believe they would be right. He didn't just do that to Daniel, either. Not a single person on the crew evaded his comedic jabs. However, that was far from his worst trait. Even around a group of East Texas rednecks, Mark's racism was off-putting. Just like with his jokes, not a single culture was off-limits, and he wasn't afraid to say exactly what he thought. I won't even get into his views on women, other than to say that Mark was simply not a good person. Funny people tend to get away with things that the rest of us can't. However, even when you are making people laugh, there is a line. And unfortunately for Mark, he crossed it one time too many.
Our family lives for the Christmas season. We are exactly the kind of people who start decorating in the middle of November, much to the annoyance of some. We have even turned the first yearly play of Maria Carey's holiday anthem into a sacred family ritual. My husband and our 3 daughters always dress in matching pajamas, a tradition that never fails to make me smile. Even though the stress of cooking a massive dinner can be overwhelming, I truly love being the heart of the family, the home where all the relatives gather when December arrives. However, there is a significant complication to our festive spirit. We are Australian. To explain for those elsewhere, while Christmas is a winter affair in America and Europe, December in Australia falls during the peak of summer. Down under, you are far more likely to be wearing a Santa hat while sunbathing than you are to be sipping eggnog by a cozy fire. Despite the heat, our holiday imagery is filled with snow-covered landscapes and red-breasted robins perched on pine trees. In Darwin, where we live, we have palm trees instead of pines. My daughters had never actually seen real snow, and by 2019, we decided it was time to change that. We ignored the people who called us crazy and booked flights to Europe for late November. The journey was incredible. While I found the long flights to be a grueling ordeal, seeing Europe's historic landmarks dusted in snow made every cramped hour in the airplane feel worthwhile. Our itinerary took us through Prague, Berlin, Rome, Copenhagen, Paris, and London. Despite the beauty of those cities, my family was most excited about visiting Ireland. The girls had convinced themselves that Ireland was a magical realm, inhabited by fairies, while my husband was equally enthusiastic about the prospect of tasting Guinness straight from the tap. When we arrived in Cork, we checked into a charming Airbnb in the suburbs. It was a semi-detached house that looked like it had been plucked straight from a storybook. Before anyone had even unpacked, the girls were already asking for the internet password. My husband works in IT, and he is very passionate about internet safety. He views it not just as a job, but as a vital way to protect our daughters from the darker corners of the web. Whenever we stay in a new place, he makes it a point to scan the network to ensure everything is secure and that parental locks are active. As I sat drinking a cup of coffee, I watched him working on his laptop and noticed a specific, troubled expression on his face that I knew meant he had found something concerning. I sat down next to him on the couch and looked at the screen, though the technical data looked like nonsense to me. I had to ask him to explain what was wrong. He pointed to a specific line of text and explained that a device was already connected to the Wi-Fi when we arrived. He accounted for our own phones and his laptop, but there was one mystery device remaining. He then opened a new window and pointed to an icon that was unmistakably the symbol for a camera. Trying to stay positive, I suggested it might just be an outdoor security camera for the property. My husband decided to walk around the entire building, but he returned saying he couldn't find a device anywhere on the exterior. He went back to his computer to use his technical skills, and a few minutes later, he called me into the kitchen. His voice had that specific dad tone, serious and urgent, but controlled so as not to alert the children that something was wrong. His eyes were wide as he showed me the laptop screen. It displayed a live video feed of the bedroom where our daughters were supposed to sleep. The view was from above, as if the camera were mounted on the ceiling. We immediately ran upstairs to the girls' room to investigate. We discovered the camera hidden inside a smoke detector, located directly over one of the beds. It was a terrifying realization that someone had planned to watch our daughters while they slept. It was easily the creepiest experience our family had ever faced. My husband called the property owner immediately to demand an explanation for the camera in the children's room. At first, the owner claimed there was no CCTV on the property at all. He even had the audacity to suggest that the video feed must be coming from a different house in the neighborhood, which was a ridiculous lie since I could clearly see my own children on the screen. My husband eventually had to threaten to send the owner a screenshot of the live feed before the man would admit the camera was theirs. The owner then tried to excuse it by claiming they were simply trying to protect their investment. My husband didn't buy the excuse and accused the man of being a voyeur, stating that we would be reporting the incident to Airbnb immediately. At that point, the owner became flustered and silent before abruptly hanging up the phone. We had called him out for being a creep, and he had no defense for his actions. We were furious and deeply unsettled, realizing we had only narrowly prevented a stranger from watching our kids all night. Even though it was late, we had the girls pack their bags while we searched for a nearby hotel. It took several months of back and forth emails with Airbnb's customer service, but we eventually received the full refund we deserved. Airbnb also informed us that they had banned the homeowner from the platform. That news provided me with much more peace of mind than the money did. I have always known that people with such dark desires exist, but I never expected to encounter one myself, especially during what was supposed to be a dream vacation. My main concern now is whether Airbnb can truly keep people like that off their site. My husband and I have asked them about the systems they use to ensure guest safety, but their answers have been far from satisfying. We pointed out that a person like that could easily create a new account using a friend's or relative's name to continue recording children without anyone knowing. The legalistic response we received essentially admitted they had no real solution for that possibility. That is the fear that stays with me. I worry that somewhere else, a child is sleeping peacefully while a stranger watches them, and there is nothing being done to stop it.
I grew up in the 80s in this little town called Durant, which is about 6 miles east of Brandon, Florida. Until I was 15 years old, my best friends in the world were these two little kids, Bobby and Joey. We were basically inseparable. Not only did we go to the same elementary and middle schools, but we spent all of our free time together. Bobby and Joey were like opposites. Like it was weird that we were even friends to begin with. Bobby was more outgoing, while Joey was more reserved. Bobby would eat just about anything, while Joey was easily the fanciest eater I've ever known. It extended to almost everything, including how scary they found horror movies. And boy, do we love horror movies. We tried just about every trick in the book to sneak into the theaters, to watch The Thing or Nightmare on Elm Street. Sometimes we succeeded, sometimes not. But when we did get in, the result was always the same. Joey would be on the verge of a panic attack for the entire show, while Bobby would be complaining about how it all looked fake or how it wasn't scary enough for him. Nothing seemed to be able to freak him out, not even the transformation scene in The American Werewolf in London. He was impressed. Sure, Kanan is the least bit grossed out or whatever. And I suppose that's why we thought the haunted house or the traveling fair wouldn't scare him either. It was late August of 1985 when the traveling fair came to town, and seeing nothing good was showing down at the local movie theater, we figured we'd stop by to see what it was all about. It was all the usual stuff: cotton candy, fairground rides, BB shooting galleries, etc. But the thing that caught our attention was the haunted house. Virginia Beach Traveling Fair looked pretty cool, and was certainly more of an attractive prospect than the carousel. So after finishing a hot dog, we headed over to the ticket booth to ask them how much. I remember the guy in the booth. He had all the skeletal face paint on, and when we asked him for 3 tickets, he put on the spooky voice like, "Are you sure you boys have the constitution for such a terrible trial?" We were just like, "Yeah, dude, just give us the tickets already." We walk up towards the entrance to go inside. So the way this thing was laid out was like a giant box room that had been divided up into corridors. You made your way through the various corridors, some which narrowed so you had to squeeze through them, and ever so often a mechanical doodad would jump out to scare you, or an actual person would. I'll admit, the actual people, one of which had on a pretty cool Wolfman mask, are pretty creepy, especially the woman who pretended to be a statue right up until we tried to pass her, and she touched my shoulder, and it almost gave me a heart attack in the process. Got to applaud that level of commitment and subtlety, right? Anyway, Joey and I thought it was pretty cool, even though he was so scared he was ready to puke. But Bobby thought the whole thing was done, so much so that he walked right up to the ticket vendor and demanded his money back. Of course, the guy just points to a little sign that says, "No refunds," but he does so in such a dismissive way that Bobby just about explodes. He started ranting about how it is the worst haunted house he'd ever been to, and that no one in their right mind should ever pay for anything so terrible. The guy talks to us for a minute or two, lowers his voice, and says something that seemed to calm Bobby down. Then when he walks back to us, we found out that this is what the guy had to say. "If you want to see something scary in there, come back later at around 10 p.m. If you're still not satisfied, we'll give you your money back." It seemed sketchy to say the least, but Bobby assured us that the guy was serious, and somehow we got into our heads that we were beginning to see the adult in the house. Bearing in mind, we were kids who had trouble getting into our rated movies, so I don't think I could underestimate how excited we were. We heard that traveling carnivals were known to get a little risque after dark, so the prospect of getting to see that sort of thing in action felt like a real adventure. Joey and I had a curfew at 9 p.m., but we got around it by saying we were staying at Bobby's. Only Bobby's mom worked as a night nurse on weekends, so there'd be no one around to disprove that. It was a foolproof plan. At least, it seemed that way for a while, but as a matter of fact, our little visit to the carnival would end our friendship and change our lives forever. The first time that something was wrong was when we showed up and the whole place seemed to be closed down. There were lights on here and there, a few workers wandering around, carrying heavy-looking tools, but other than that, the place was deserted. At first, I figured the guy just played a trick on us, as in, "Come back later, but I'll be long gone." But Bobby was determined to get his money back, and we followed him through the carnival grounds until we came across the haunted house. True to his word, the ticket teller was sitting on the steel chairs that led up to the entrance. He made some comment about being surprised, which showed us how he figured we were too chicken to come back for the midnight show, as he called it. We just laughed. Midnight show. It wasn't a minute past 10 p.m., and there he was trying to be all spooky again. But then, Bobby asked him what was so scary about the midnight show, and if he'd be given a refund if it didn't frighten him. Again, the guy promises, if it doesn't spook him, he gets his money back. But what he said next really set me on edge, and immediately had me thinking twice about my decision to return. He started by saying how the carnival didn't like leaving paying visitors unhappy, and if we wanted to be scared, he could show us something that had to leave us very frightened indeed. He said it was something to keep in reserve for those dissatisfied with the haunted house, something that very few have come to witness without losing their sanity altogether. He said only a small, dedicated crew handles the midnight show, because the sheer psychological strain of the performance can be extremely harmful to their mental health. I remember Bobby piping up like, "I'm not dumb, dude. I see what you're doing. He's just gonna beat the snot out of us when we get in here as payback for talking smack." The guy laughed, then swore on his mother's grave that each of us would walk in on our own volition and walk out unharmed. As for our sanity, he couldn't guarantee it would still be in one piece by the end. Joey was out from the word go. He's like, "Nope, screw this. I'm not going in." Bobby, on the other hand, was typical Bobby. I don't think wild horses could have dragged him away from that carnival. But for me, there was something about the way the ticket vendor was talking. He wasn't trying to sound scary or be scary. He actually sounded kind of scared himself, almost like he didn't want us to go in. And either he was an Oscar-level acting talent, or there was really something to what he was saying. I'll never forget the way Bobby looked at me when I said, "Yeah, I'm good. Actually, I think I'll stay here with Joey." It was like disgust mixed with ridicule. I know for a fact he thought I was being a big baby for having let the carny dude psych me out, but I made up my mind. I wasn't going to budge. In the end, Bobby went down on his own. Well, Joey and I waited for him outside. I could tell he felt a little nervous walking in, but I was nervous too. I was nervous for him, because as much as we'd been reassured that nothing was going to happen to him, a little piece of me thought Bobby was going to get his bell rang as soon as he walked in. Me and Joker outside for maybe 10 to 15 minutes, waiting for Bobby, while wondering what could be going on in that haunted house. There wasn't any noise or anything, and our walk through in the daytime had taken like 5 minutes tops. So when 20 to 25 to 30 minutes went by, we started to get pretty freaking worried for Bobby. Only right when we were about to go banging on the door of the haunted house, Bobby reappears, with no limps, no swelling, and no bleeding. He looked okay, but he wasn't, and I'm not sure Bobby was ever really okay again. I remember walking back to his mom's place like it was yesterday, the exasperation I felt when we asked Bobby what happened, and all he said was nothing. We were flabbergasted. It certainly didn't seem like nothing had happened, because Bobby was definitely shaken up by something. At first, he was pale, visibly shaken, and he had this kind of vacant expression on his face. It's hard to explain. He seemed mostly shocked by whatever it was he had just seen, but he was definitely disturbed too. We kept begging him to tell us what he'd seen, but he just wouldn't say. All he gave us was nothing. Stop asking about it. We asked him if it was scary, and he said yes, but he denied any kind of violence had occurred. The guy promised he wouldn't be touched, and he'd apparently been true to his word on that, too. But that didn't mean they hadn't done something to Bobby. And despite all his denials, I know that was the case. The last thing he said about it before he threatened to kick us out of his mom's house if we asked again was a couple of hours later, when Joy broke down and asked him, "Dude, I'm begging you, at least give us a clue what happened in there." "Something that doesn't make sense," Bobby replied. He never talked about it again. I know that seems unbelievable, but time moves pretty fast at that age. We were due to start our junior year of high school. I started dating that first semester. Joey broke his arm on Bobby's skateboard that winter, and there was other stuff to think about. I'm not saying we just forgot about it. And it came up in conversation once or twice in the months that followed, but every time we brought it up, Bobby would just give us this look, and the one time we persisted, he just walked back home without a word and didn't return our calls for a week. I'd like to say that dropping the subject for good repaired our friendship, but it didn't. Like I might have said earlier, what happened that night was the beginning of the end of our little friendship triangle, and we slowly began to drift apart. The end of the end, if that makes any sense, was when Bobby and his mom moved out to New Hampshire for her new job. We all promised we'd keep in touch, but we never did. And I think Joey and I just bummed each other out after that, and we were wondering what happened to Bobby, always hoping he'd call someday, but he didn't call. And we didn't even get the number for his new place. I still think about Bobby an awful lot, and I still think about him saying something that didn't make any sense. I've racked my dumb brain for literally decades, but I just can't work out what he meant by that. My wife thinks he was lying, and that those carnival workers really did lay hands on him or something. Just because he didn't have any cuts or bruises doesn't mean they didn't slap him around or threaten him a little. And besides, you can do a lot worse things to someone without leaving a black eye or a bruised lip. I sometimes wonder if that really is true. What would happen to him that was so traumatic that he just couldn't deal with it? Bobby was a brave man. I think he was the bravest and most defiant person I've ever known. If the tough thing needed doing, Bobby did it. And I think that if that thing just so happened to be opening up about being hurt or something, Bobby would have done it maybe later than rather sooner. But he would have, and I think I'll just end it there. Whenever I talk about Bobby, every third word out of my mouth is maybe. I'm so sick of maybes I can barely even describe it. I just hope his story isn't over yet. But he's out there somewhere, living a happy, fruitful life. I tried to look for him on Facebook ever so often, just to see if he made an account or something. But I've had no luck as of yet. But maybe next week, or maybe next year, I'll finally find out what happened to Bobby and get to say hello to an old friend in the process. Maybe. Just maybe.
Getting entangled in office politics is an experience many professionals share, often finding themselves the target of a scheme before they even realize a game is being played. It is a common reality in the modern workplace, and I'm certainly no exception. I eventually fell victim to the toxic environment created by a particularly deceitful coworker. While I have always believed it is vital to emotionally separate our personal feelings about colleagues from the requirements of the job, not everyone possesses that level of maturity. Those who cannot make that distinction often end up becoming a source of poison within an organization. This particular chapter of my life took place when I was working at a supervisor level for a construction firm. Most people have an internal radar for when someone dislikes them. It is a subtle, instinctual vibration. I had an assistant named Joshua who consistently gave off that energy. Every time he spoke to me or stood in my vicinity, I could see a deep-seated loathing in his eyes, his voice, and his guarded body language. For a long time, I didn't let it bother me. I accepted that everyone is entitled to their own opinion of their peers. I was a relatively strict supervisor when it came to site safety and productivity, so I assumed his resentment stemmed from my management style. While his attitude was a minor annoyance, I never allowed it to compromise my professional performance. However, I eventually realized that dismissing a colleague's growing resentment was one of the most significant professional blunders I ever made. I mistakenly believed that a junior employee's dislike couldn't actually hurt me. I should have addressed it the very first time he spoke back to me with disrespect. Instead, I let it slide. On a subsequent occasion, when he committed a serious error on site, I went as far as to scold him privately but take the full blame in front of senior management. I did this out of a misplaced sense of mentorship, fearing he would be fired if the truth came out. Looking back, I realized that protecting him only emboldened his behavior. My routine involved arriving at the construction site several minutes before the shift began, because my role required me to travel and inspect various satellite locations. I frequently had to delegate the supervision of the main site to Joshua. One afternoon, while I was occupied at a remote location, my manager called me in a state of frustration. He informed me that a significant problem had developed at the main site, and more importantly, there was no supervisor present to handle it. This confused me because I had specifically instructed Joshua to be there. In fact, I had called him that very morning, and he had explicitly confirmed that he was on site and everything was running smoothly. This wasn't the first time I had arrived to find mountains of unfinished work despite his assurances, but I had stubbornly refused to believe he was being intentionally negligent. I dropped everything and rushed to the main site to resolve the crisis. After fixing the issue and enduring a harsh reprimand from the manager for the lapse in oversight, I attempted to call Joshua. His phone was disconnected. It wasn't until the following evening that I received a brief text message from him claiming he had an urgent matter that forced him to leave the site early. It was clear to me then that someone had tipped him off about the manager's phone call. I felt a surge of frustration. Despite the numerous times I had covered for his mistakes and shielded him from consequences, he was still slacking off and actively putting my career at risk. The situation escalated when I happened to overhear a group of coworkers whispering in the break room. They were discussing a plot Joshua had devised to get me fired so that he could move up and take my position. Given that he was my direct assistant and the most logical successor, the motive made perfect sense. I didn't hesitate. I stepped into the room and interrupted their conversation to ask for the full story. Caught off guard, they admitted that Joshua had tried to recruit them into his plan to undermine my authority. They quickly assured me they had no intention of helping him, and I told them that as long as they remained silent about our conversation, I would let the matter drop with them. At that point, I was finished being the nice boss. His reckless behavior and blatant betrayal required a firm response. I decided it was time to demonstrate exactly who held the authority in our professional relationship. I spent the week crafting a plan to expose his dishonesty, choosing the upcoming weekend for the execution because we were scheduled for 12-hour shifts, the perfect window to catch him in a lie. On Friday, I intentionally gave Joshua false information. I told him that I would be away all weekend inspecting a different site and that he was solely responsible for supervising the high-priority main site. This was a trap. In reality, the company had designated the main site as the top priority for the weekend and had specifically ordered both of us to be there for constant supervision. Joshua, unaware of the actual orders from the front office, believed he had a free pass to skip work while I was away. On Saturday morning, I arrived at the site 4 hours early, while the gates were still locked and the grounds were empty. Shortly after the shift was supposed to begin, Joshua actually called me first. With an air of confidence, he lied directly to my face, claiming he had just arrived at the site and was currently overseeing the crew. I was standing in the very spot he claimed to be, looking at an empty field. To build my case, I asked the security guards to assist me. I had them walk the perimeter with me while videotaping the empty supervisor's station to prove he was absent. I also made sure to record every phone call we had throughout the day. Every time I checked in, he doubled down on the lie, insisting he was busy working on site. On Monday morning, I decided to give him one final opportunity to be honest. I sat him down and asked him directly if he had covered the site over the weekend as instructed. Without a hint of hesitation, he claimed he had been there the entire time. It was his last chance to come clean and perhaps save his job, but his fixation on taking my position blinded him to the reality of the situation. At that moment, I knew I had to follow through with the evidence I had gathered. Since I did not have the direct authority to fire him myself, I compiled the video footage, the call recordings and the statements from the security guards, and submitted a formal report to the HR department. I also disclosed the history of his previous lies that I had foolishly covered up in the past. The company launched a swift investigation, and within a week, Joshua was terminated. I made sure to thank the other coworkers who had alerted me to his plans. That experience changed my management philosophy forever. I learned that while being a supportive boss is important, letting mistakes slide out of a sense of kindness can often be a fatal mistake. You may think you are helping someone get ahead, but they might just be planning your downfall.
It all happened when I was babysitting for this family in my town. Their daughters were 6 and 10. I was 16 back then. I ordered the pizza, and we all ate that, and then went on to play video games for the next hour or so, until Mabel, the young daughter, wanted to sleep. Mabel slept, and Violet, who was the older one, discussed the idea of watching Nightmare on Elm Street. Now, I don't know if her parents would have allowed that. I even wondered why they even hired a babysitter, since Violet was pretty responsible herself. But the matter of fact, I agreed to watch the Nightmare at Elm Street. Did not want to look like an uptight dude. So we started watching it, and I brought in popcorn. She was pretty terrified, and we were sharing the blanket on our feet, quietly enjoying the movie. At around midway in the movie, we started hearing rustling noises on the outside. At first I thought maybe their parents were home, so I told her to switch to The Princess Bride so I don't get scolded for showing a horror flick. As I got, there was nothing. I got back inside and she was on the phone. It was her parents. They said they'd be late. The roads have been blocked and there is a rumor that the power will go shortly. They ordered me to go back and instructed the daughter to shut the doors and sleep. She told me that I just couldn't shake the feeling of leaving both of them alone, so I stayed with them just to make sure. We stood there talking about things. She was smarter than her age, and she asked me all the questions about school and stuff, and we ended up doing her homework. And the power just went off cold, but we were ready. I told her to go to her sister, and she did. I stood down and locked all the doors and windows. It felt like a storm would build up. I went up and informed her about everything. 3 of us gathered around the TV so it could be easier in case we had to make a run for things or cover. We got together to talk about things while Mabel slept. It was like one of those slumber parties that we had as a kid, and we chatted a lot until the room started shaking. It felt like it was an earthquake. I quickly made Rabel and Violet go take a cover and did it myself. I rolled on the flashlight to them and told them to make way for the door outside. Before all the shaking, they made their way to the door and we stepped outside. It was just the 3 of us and a couple more people since everybody was already out of town due to vacations. And as we stepped outside, we turned on the flashlights. Violet was holding me tightly, and I was carrying Mabel as she closed her eyes. Violet closed her eyes all the time too. And in a few minutes, a stream of lights made the night sky bright, and as it happened, I told Violet to open her eyes. It was beautiful. It seemed like a big flat square disc making its way to the sky. It was flying way closer than most flying vehicles, as an airplane or gliders or helicopters did. I and Violet and Mabel kept looking at it, mesmerized. The sky was all red, and soon, as we were in awe, we were terrified. As it rained fire from the rear of that unidentified object, almost as if it was crashing, I held the girls with all my grip strength, and we ran towards the house and took cover. We huddled together beneath the table, wrapping ourselves with Mabel's blanket. After an hour later, we went outside. The smoke from that flying object withered the whole city invisible, and the redness of its light was still there. Our town looked exactly like that upside down from Stranger Things. This was the memory that Stranger Things brought for me. Mabel and Violet's parents were very grateful, and I did not leave as they arrived at around 8 in the morning. The UFO was a government spacecraft mission that failed and crashed at an abandoned site not far from our town. I shortly moved to New York that next summer. Moving forward to 10 years, I was 26 and out on a date. My date came in and introduced herself. We lived in a small town. It was Violet. She was 20 and was studying at NYU. We started dating, and the first thing we discussed was the night that it all happened. We have been married for 4 years now, and it all came back to us when we binge-watched the Stranger Things, almost as if it had a part of our life somewhere in it. Back in '89, our town was going through some big changes, and a new nuclear plant was being moved to that place. So our town became the last stop before the plant, and that brought in people, new people. Smart out-of-town people were moving to our place and making it the ideal place of development and progress. The place where once the most technological thing was the local radio station was now getting things that were blowing people's minds. Ever since the new people moved in as the construction started, we got an arcade, a movie theater, a shopping mall, and all the new city things. At first, the locals were enraged over the idea of strange people coming in and taking business. But soon, everybody was getting employed. The new school started construction and was going to bring in more opportunities for students, and more horizons were opening up for the place. My father, on the other hand, was very skeptical of all of this. He never wanted these people to come in. He always said If Oppenheimer was scared of the things that he made, how can we be so sure that these things will work for us? And there was this one thing that he always said: progress comes at a price. He was a farmer. He was deeply rooted in the land, and everything modern scared him. The people from the government sent him a proposal of buying land and tried their best. At first, my father refused. But then one of the family friends that were working with the government told him that the bank will eventually seize the land, so it is better to get it for the value than just getting it seized. My father had no choice but to accept the offer. The money from the land was put onto investment, and I was sent to New York for further study, where I lived with my aunt. My father and mother relocated to another house a bit distant from the plant. I was out in New York going during August, and I was busy with the classes. I came back home and saw my aunt. She was in tears that there was this weird gut feeling that I had. My aunt came in. She held me tightly and told me that our town was gone. I thought at first that maybe it was one of her moods. She always had those. She was a 35-year-old single woman working in theaters. She was doing a Shakespeare play at that time, and all I could think of was that maybe this is one of her melodramatic moments. I just held her. But then she dropped the bomb and said, "It's our town. Devon is gone now, blown into pieces. There was a nuclear accident, something about the leaks. They say that the people are barely alive and they are being quarantined at the moment." It all hit me so quickly. All I wanted to do was go up to the town and look into the matter. But there was nothing in the media. It was being kept a hush. I was worried and sick to my stomach, and there was no way to contact our parents. Then one day out of the blue, a month later, we got the call. It was covered with a feeble voice, and it was my father telling me that they were all right and they were sheltered from the accident, and that the whole town was all right. It was really weird to hear from them about a month later everything, and he told me not to tell this to anyone. It was strange, and there was something very different about his voice. It was too gentle with me. That is not what he usually is when it comes to talking to me. It seems as if the accident just broke him, and then later, I asked him to put the mother on phone. And while he was doing that, I could hear the radio noise at the background, which was very different from the noise we hear on a crooked telephone. It was almost like a chatter that would come from a busy office. I asked him for his location, and at that moment, the phone got disconnected, and I wasn't even able to talk to Mother. My aunt was much more relieved to hear the news about them being alive. And even though I was pretending to be happy, there was something that was worrying me. I had a gut feeling that something else was going on there. I did not tell her about anything, as it was the last thing I wanted her to worry about. And then by saying that I'm going off on a camp, I decided to look into the matter on my own. I went to the nearest town, and to my surprise, everything within the 10-mile radius of our town was now basically a government jurisdiction area. I had to sneak around the fences to get the protective gear. I was going into this alone. And to my surprise, there was not a single hit of radiation in that place. It was all a cover-up story. There was no sign of any radioactive accident, and not a single house looked destroyed. Whatever was happening, government sure wanted to keep it top secret. Knowing that there's no risk of getting exposed to radiation was a relief, and it helped me right back on track to look for the real thing. I entered my home quietly, and everything was placed right where it was. I did not realize that there were already cameras placed into the system, when suddenly, my phone rang. It was Dad. He asked me what I was doing there when I was warned to stay away. I asked him what happened, and then what he told me was much harder for me to believe than it is for you. He said it was the night, and they were all asleep, and suddenly, everything started shaking. We were all going for the drill that we had been told about. As we got out of bed, we just were broken into these million particles, and we lost our physicality. We woke up, and we saw that the only way to be present is through electricity or source of it. And everyone in the town is alive, but we are all nothing more than living electromagnetic waves. He told me he cannot explain to me how it feels, but then he told me to come closer to the television. And then as I did, without powering it on, I saw my father inside the television. And there he told me that this is the only way that can. And also said that last he saw my mother was when she tried getting into the computer. She has been lost since then. I was confused, and everything was unreal, until a unit invaded my house and took me with them to a lab. All the way, I was begging to not kill me. And then I met Dr. Laudsky, and she told me to not worry. Since I was already a computer science student, she told me that my exposure is risky. It was at that moment that my life took a drastic turn, and I could never escape this place, not without finding a way to get them all out first. After searching for 2 years, I finally cracked the case, or the code, I must say. But in the carelessness, I made myself particleized. But good thing is that I get to understand everything from 0 to 1 now that I am a binary code.
Have any of you given that Bumble app a go? I know it seems massively counterintuitive to download an app which requires the girl to make the first move, when they're notoriously not the ones to make the first move. But I can assure you, it's definitely worth it. But at the same time, I think the single worst thing that happened to me in 2020 took place just as a result of a Bumble date. So it all started when I matched with a Welsh girl named Lima. After a day or two of talking, we agreed to meet at a little cafe for a few coffees. We hit it off talking about this and that, and before you know it, we were chatting like we'd known each other for years. 1 hour turned to 2, 2 to 3, and still neither of us was ready to call time on the date. Neither of us drank alcohol that evening. Her for religious reasons, me because I'm something of a fitness freak. But while she was drinking mocktails, I was on the coffee, and I was on it big time. There came a point where I needed a wee so badly because of my medical issues. The wait became an absolute nightmare. I was struggling to keep my composure while waiting for the one-person toilet to be free. This happened every half an hour without fail almost all night. I had to interrupt her, apologize, and leg it off to the little bathroom to relieve myself. I felt like an absolute idiot having to nip off to the laos so often. But every time I emerged, she'd look up and smile, waving away my apologies with some light mockery of how I have the bladder of a 4-year-old. But one time, I emerged from the toilet to see that she was no longer sitting alone, and that someone was sitting in my seat. At first, I thought she'd just bumped into a guy she knew. She certainly looked quite comfortable talking to him, but it turned out to be the complete opposite. I walked up behind him and playfully put my hands on his shoulders. I told him in a joking way that he might be in my seat. It wasn't confrontational or aggressive, just pure banter. I expected the guy to jump up, maybe warmly apologize, maybe give a little introduction, something like that. But he didn't. He looked back at me with this look on his face that clearly signaled he wanted me to get my hands off him immediately. And as he was staring up at me, Lima shot me a look as if to ask for help. Only then did I realize the situation was not what I thought, and I asked if they actually knew each other. Turns out this bloke had been sitting alone enjoying some food and wine and had been making eyes at Lima every so often. Then, when I'd gone off for a wee, he'd taken his opportunity, sat in my seat, and then began to, as Lima put it, flirt so outrageously forward that she felt like she was going to be sick. Now, I actually had to ask this guy to leave us alone before he got up and finally gave me my chair back, but not before he tried to stare me out. I had a few inches on him, and I could tell he didn't put half the gym time in that I did, so it's not like I was in the least bit intimidated. It just seemed like he was trying really, really hard to be some comic book idea of what women want, and was honestly a little bit pathetic. He looked completely and utterly harmless, like a chocolate pistol. He looked like he'd melt at the first sign of trouble. But as I found out later that night, looks can be dangerously deceiving. So, after the little confrontation at the table, Lima and I laughed it off, then carried on with our night. Now Lima could see over my shoulder and therefore also see the creepy guy, but all I could see in front of me was her and one of the cafe's walls. So I had to rely on her to let me know if the guy was still there. I honestly expected him to just leave after such a confrontation. Everyone in the cafe was watching. It was pretty mortifying, but he didn't. He stayed put and continued to make eyes at Lima, which to her credit she just ignored. But then when it came to me walking her home, he got up and paid his bill too. Then yep, you guessed it. I looked over my shoulder as we were passing through Chinatown, and I saw a tiny mister stare out. He was still keeping up the intimidation game by staring out from under his brow, obviously too drunk to realize he looked far more comical than scary. Don't get me wrong, I wasn't exactly scared at that point, but we were being followed. It made for something of a tense situation, but nothing I thought I couldn't handle. As we approached her apartment block, I asked Lima if she was comfortable going inside while the guy could see where she lived. She admitted to being uncomfortable about it, but the block had dozens of flats in it, and unless he got in the door behind her, there was little chance of him working out which unit she lived in. But as it turned out, Lima was way more concerned about me and actually invited me inside for a nightcap. I didn't assume that I was getting lucky, but I wasn't about to turn her down. So I went inside for a cup of this weird ginger tea and the comfort that our little stalker friend would soon get bored and wander off. I was in her flat for no less than an hour, and by that time, each of us was confident that our new friend had departed. We even checked out of her bathroom window, which looked down into the street, and he was nowhere to be seen. I thanked her for a good night. We had a little smooch, and I started my walk home with that lighter-than-air feeling you get after a successful date. It's around that time that I started thinking about how strange it would be if that loser was somehow still following me, which prompted me to look over my shoulder. Lo and behold, there was a single figure following me, maybe 50 or 60 meters behind, with a remarkably similar silhouette to the lad who'd tried following us. I have to admit to being in a state of disbelief for a moment as I stopped and studied the figure as they approached. Then after passing under a streetlight, I got a clear look at the person. It was him. I said out loud that he had to be joking, and immediately he stopped. I knew it was him, so him playing at being a statue didn't make a blind bit of difference. I just told him to keep his distance, and there'd be no problems. Then just carried on the 20-minute walk back to my place. Every so often I checked over my shoulder, and this lad was still behind me. Granted, he was some way away, but he was definitely following me. And the closer we got to my apartment, the more it became obvious that he was making a considerable effort to close the distance. Now, unlike Lima, the apartment I lived in was just one of two in this big old Edwardian. I had the top floors, while the other tenant had the ground floor and the basement, complete with his entrance. And if this lad saw what door I went into, he'd have my flat. He wouldn't have to guess which one of 60 I was in. He would know exactly where I lived. Obviously, I was not in the least bit comfortable with that, so I decided on a little show of force to deter my new follower. I turned around and just marched right at him. Then, when I was within about spitting distance, I gave him a piece of my mind about being a creep and a loser, promising I'd hurt him if he carried on following me. It seemed to have the desired effect as he started walking off in the complete opposite direction. It was really strange, but I carried on walking, checking over my shoulder one more time, and he was gone. Problem solved, right? Well, not quite. About a minute or two went by, and I reached the entrance to a fairly small park. My flat was literally just on the other side of it, so I was in this blissful ignorance of thinking that not only had I scared the creepy guy off, but that I was so close to home that nothing could possibly hurt me now. I mean, I was on home base, right in my big old backyard. Besides, I'd had a great night. I had drinks with this gorgeous anesthesiologist, definitely securing myself a second date in the process. And I'd had myself a little tough guy moment with that absolute idiot. Then everything flashed bright for a second and I felt my knees just buckling under me, almost as if though my brain had switched off power to them. I honestly don't know if I was knocked out for a second or two, but I do know that the next thing I could feel was this sharp, hot pain in the back left side of my head. I knew that I'd been hit by something, I just didn't know what or by whom. I was so dazed that it didn't even occur to me that it could have been him. I honestly thought I was just being mugged or something, in which case it wouldn't have been my first rodeo. I'd been mugged at knife point in London back when I was a student, and I knew to just keep my mouth shut, hand over the valuables, and get away with nothing but damaged pride and a lump on my head. So the only thing I did before trying to find my feet was to toss out my wallet and phone onto the concrete and tell whoever it was to just take it and leave me. I heard someone wheeze a laugh, probably at how pathetic I looked. But when they spoke, I knew exactly who it was. He mocked me, saying he thought I was going to kick his head in and told me to look at myself now. Then he kicked me. They kicked me so hard in the side of the head that I thought my orbital socket might be broken. And in between worrying that I'd end up losing my eye if they kicked me again, it dawned on me the little Tao, Rag, who'd been following, had somehow found a way to cut me off and ambush me. And it became quite obvious that I was in much more trouble than I'd first anticipated. The phone and wallet weren't going to cut it. I needed to get on my feet, and fast. It didn't matter that I was taller and stronger, maybe even faster than this guy. He had the upper hand, and let me tell you, that was not a nice feeling. The force of the kick sent me off balance, but I tried to use the momentum to find my feet. If I was drunk, I'd have been utterly screwed, but since I was sober, I did actually manage to get both feet on the ground before trying to bring myself upright. But no. Another kick hit me right in the corner of the mouth and I was sent flying backwards again. This time, not only was my mouth filling up with blood, but I could feel the teeth on the left-hand side of my mouth grinding together where the kick had chipped a few of them. It sent my skin crawling as I spat the blood out. I put my hand out and felt something cold and metallic, a fence on which I was once again trying to pull myself up. But again, right as I was about to find my feet, the guy attacked. Only this time, he didn't strike me. He wrapped one arm around my neck and held something cold and sharp over my right eye. I'm not sure if it was a knife or a piece of glass or whatever, but I think that was the single most terrifying moment of my life, thinking that I was going to be blind and hoping I'll be able to buck him off before he went for my throat or something. Only he didn't cut me. Instead, he hissed something right into my ear. Let's just say brevity wasn't his strong suit, and the actual words were as gloating, vicious, and vile as you can imagine, with plenty of references to the date I'd been on that evening. I didn't beg. I didn't cry. I just waited for whatever was going to happen. But thank God he must have seen sense or something. He made a comment about how I was only going to be alive the next day because he decided to let me live. After that, he gave me one more good punch to the side of the face. Then all I heard was the sound of trainers hitting concrete as he legged it. I spent the next few minutes spitting out blood as I tried to find my phone. I think he'd either stamped on it or I'd maybe tossed it with a little too much force because the screen was smashed into bits. But again, a little bit of divine intervention meant it worked just enough for me to hammer out an emergency call, after which I dragged myself to the park's gates and sat there waiting for the ambulance to turn up. Aside from a bit of concussion, a lot of swelling and some chipped teeth, I was pretty much all right. There was no skull fracture, no broken orbital socket, nothing like that. Although I'd been lucky to say the least. The doctor said the first wound on the back of my head looked like it had come from a brick or a large rock, and if he'd hit me any harder with it in that particular spot, there's a good chance he'd have just killed me with his first strike. And that was the really scary bit, thinking that all the kicks and punches and threats that came after were like a weird blessing. I was still alive when in some timelines, I would be checking in for the big sleep. I was angry about it for a long, long time. and I'd be a liar if I said I didn't let that attack change my behavior for the worse for a while. Seeing the guy getting 6 years for assault and grievous bodily harm really helped things. But still, that wasn't enough for me on some level, and it took me a while to acquiesce. Me and Lima carried on dating for a few months, which was lovely. But she had to move away for work, so obviously we had to call time on it. And the 4 trips to the dentist were terrible, as they basically had to file and cap my teeth one at a time. And that was definitely the worst part. How 5 minutes turned into an ordeal that lasted months of court dates and dental appointments. That's my one big takeaway from the whole thing, really. How one little misunderstanding can have terrifyingly far-reaching consequences.
That morning, I woke up with a pounding, persistent headache that enveloped my entire head. The pain felt absolutely unbearable, so I made the decision to call in sick to get some much-needed rest. However, my boss, who was typically very lenient, chose to be uncharacteristically strict and insisted that I report to work on time. Although I felt a surge of frustration, I had no choice but to obey his order. I climbed out of bed and began preparing for the shift with an immense amount of effort. I took a shower, put on my uniform, and applied my makeup. But I moved through these motions with practically zero energy. Before I left my house, I swallowed a few aspirin to dull the pain, desperately hoping it would help me survive the day ahead. While I was on my way to the airport, I decided that I would cause a disturbance once I arrived at work. I planned to attribute my poor performance to my physical condition and my boss's refusal to grant me a day off. Upon arriving at the airport, I shot an exasperated, pointed glare in my boss's direction, but he chose to completely ignore me. This lack of reaction only intensified my boiling frustration. However, just as the very last passenger boarded their flight, my boss suddenly knelt on one knee in front of me and produced a stunning diamond ring. The sight of that ring instantly melted away every ounce of anger I had been feeling. He asked me if I would make him the happiest man on earth by agreeing to marry him. I began nodding my head with immense vigor as soon as those words left his lips. He slipped that beautiful piece of jewelry onto my ring finger before standing up to pull me into a nice, juicy kiss. I sighed with profound relief that I hadn't skipped work that day, finally understanding why he had been so insistent that I come in. Sam and I had been in a relationship for quite a while. Despite the fact that he is a pilot, we always refrained from displaying any outward affection toward each other in public, preferring to act lovey-dovey only in the privacy of our home. During work hours, he treats me exactly the same way as any other flight attendant, which could sometimes feel quite hurtful. But I always understood the professional reason behind his behavior. Still, the way he surprised me with that proposal made me incredibly happy. I had never really envisioned a dream proposal, but the way he chose to do it was so profoundly romantic that it made me fall in love with him all over again. After the incredibly romantic proposal and receiving countless heartfelt congratulations from my co-workers and the awestruck passengers, we resumed our duties. I found myself happily whistling to the tune of Lover by Taylor Swift. To my complete surprise, my persistent headache had disappeared entirely, as though it had never existed in the first place. While I was assisting a passenger, I noticed a man sitting behind her who looked to be in his late 30s. He clutched his suitcase with such an intense, desperate grip that it looked as though it contained a piece of his very soul. The sight struck me as inherently suspicious, and I could not help but wonder what exactly could be hidden inside that bag. I approached him and politely requested that he please put his bag in the overhead locker. The man turned his gaze toward me with a cold and deeply unfriendly expression, as if my simple request had somehow personally offended him. I repeated my request in a calm, steady tone, hoping to avoid any potential confrontation. Unfortunately, he remained stubbornly silent, which left me feeling frustrated and unsure of how to proceed. Just as I was turning to leave, he whispered something that immediately caught my full attention. He told me to do exactly what he said, or he would blow up the entire plane. I stared at him in complete disbelief, scanning his thin frame from head to toe. He looked like he was made of nothing but skin and bones, and the expression on his face did not seem like the kind someone would make while pulling a cruel prank. I tried to ignore him, convincing myself he was just muttering to himself, but then he provided a quick, frightening sneak peek inside his suitcase, which contained a tangle of red wires and something that looked unmistakably like a bomb. I was filled with absolute shock and paralyzing fear when he threatened me to stay quiet and handed me a written note intended for the captain. My heart began thumping uncontrollably against my ribs, and my eyes widened in response to the sudden, deadly threat. It was supposed to be the most joyous day of my life, but instead, this was slowly morphing into a terrifying nightmare as I felt helpless, scared, and deeply confused. As I stood there, frozen in the aisle, my legs began to tremble with overwhelming fear, similar to the way a venomous snake might slowly creep up on its prey. I walked toward the cockpit, and as soon as Sam noticed me, he immediately looked concerned and began asking me what was wrong. That was the moment I handed him the note from the mysterious man. Both he and the co-pilot gave me a deeply puzzled look before unfolding and reading the message. The man had requested a hefty sum of ransom money, along with a parachute, clearly stating that he would detonate the device if his demands were denied. In a moment of extreme tension and mortal danger, the captain approached the man with remarkable calm. He made a request that would ultimately determine the fate of everyone on board. He asked the man to deactivate the bomb before jumping off the plane. Surprisingly, the man agreed to comply. With the full support of the crew, we began collecting money from every passenger to fulfill his demand. It was a desperate, collective attempt to save our lives, and every member of our team contributed whatever cash they had on hand, hoping that it would be enough to secure a chance for our survival. The moment the man prepared to jump off after supposedly defusing the bomb, the captain knocked him unconscious with a single swift punch. Honestly, I wasn't surprised in the slightest, given how bony and frail the man had appeared. Upon a closer inspection of the suitcase, it looked a bit suspicious. After the plane landed safely, and the man was taken into police custody, the bag was sent for a thorough inspection, where it turned out the device was completely fake. Subsequently, the man confessed that he and his spouse had conspired to commit these deeds because they were exhausted from being heavily indebted. Furthermore, as a more detailed inquiry was conducted, it was brought to light that he had perpetrated numerous burglaries, with his wife serving as the mastermind behind each of these illicit acts. He was later sentenced to 17 years in prison for his past crimes, including many counts of conspiracy, and 13 additional years for his felony of attempted aircraft hijacking. Sam told me that the penalty for hijacking a plane is typically a death sentence, but because no one was harmed, and because he did not actually intend to harm anyone, given he was carrying a fake bomb, the judge took pity on him. The day I got proposed to was a literal roller coaster of emotions. I never anticipated experiencing such an intense whirlwind of drama and fear, but it was still the best and worst day of my life. Thankfully, I haven't encountered any similar situations since then, and I am now eagerly counting down the days until my wedding in just 2 short months.
This past year, my wife and I had an unsettling experience. As soon as quarantine was lifted, we went for a hike at our local state park. Something we used to do regularly, even before we were married. I was personally looking forward to it. Our plan was to hike to a particular lake, spend the night, and hike back to the car the next day. It was a clear, warm day with nice and dry trails. For most of the morning, we were the only people out there. We decided to stop for lunch at a campsite about halfway to the lake, where we found another couple had the same idea. They were sitting at the concrete picnic table, and we asked if we could join them. Soon, all 4 of us were talking about what we had seen on the trail, and where we were headed. The couple revealed they were newlyweds on their honeymoon. My wife, a hopeless romantic, loved this and proceeded to tell them how we had met and other sentimental stories. 2 hours passed before we finally said our goodbyes. We arrived at the lake about an hour before dark, tired and hungry. I started a fire while my wife, Mandy, cooked a small meal. as I pitched the tent. We sat around the fire, cooking s'mores, and eventually went to bed around 10 p.m. I woke up just before dawn the next morning to get the fire ready for breakfast. We repeated our roles from the night before, except this time I took the tent down and repacked it. After cooking, we made sure the fire was completely out and then started our return journey at 10 a.m. When we reached the halfway point, we chose not to stop. 2 hours later, we ran into the husband from the couple we had met the previous day. Strangely, his wife was not with him. Mandy asked about her, and the man explained that she had become ill the night before and had returned home. Before we could ask anything else, he added that his wife had insisted he finish the trip alone. It sounded strange, but we had no reason to doubt him. Just then, a group of people came walking up, and the husband excused himself to talk to them. I wasn't interested in prying further, as I felt their marriage was none of my business. I thought Mandy wanted to stay, but I reminded her of our obligations that night. She reluctantly agreed, and we continued on our way. We reached the parking lot not long after and packed up our things. There were a few groups of people talking amongst themselves, and as we were pulling out, several more cars, including a Ranger's truck, were pulling in. Again, I didn't think much of it. We made it home that afternoon and took care of some family matters. It wasn't until breakfast the next morning that we heard the news. I sat down with a cup of coffee and turned on the TV, just in time for a report about a dead female camper. When they showed her face, I almost choked on my coffee. It was the woman we had met just 2 days prior. I yelled for Mandy to join me in the living room to be sure of what I was seeing. Not having my glasses on, I pointed at the TV and asked her if that was one of the newlyweds from the park. She watched for a moment and let out a shocked gasp. A wedding photo of the couple then appeared on the screen, and Mandy grabbed the remote to turn up the volume. According to the husband, the couple had been at a popular cliffside lookout. Mandy and I had been there ourselves a few times. He claimed they had watched the sunrise, and as they were preparing to leave, his wife lost her footing and fell several hundred feet to the ground below. It was certainly possible, but something bothered me. I wondered why he hadn't mentioned this to us. More importantly, I questioned the story about her being ill, which he had told us only a few hours after the incident supposedly occurred. None of his behavior made any sense. I knew if something like that had happened to my wife, I would have been a mess. It all seemed fishy, and I was glad to see that Mandy agreed with me. It seemed her instincts had been right again, though I wouldn't tell her that. After a long discussion, we agreed to contact the law enforcement involved in the case. As it stood, the husband was not under any public suspicion. I contacted the sheriff's office and told them what we knew. The deputy put us on hold for a moment and then returned to say that someone might reach out to us in the future. It has been almost a year now, and no one has contacted us. This is what brings me to write to you. My instincts and my wife's tell us that a crime may have occurred. However, we have no proof or any real justification for our feelings. If law enforcement believed we had something important to offer, they surely would have contacted us by now, right? I don't want to be a nuisance or cause trouble for a grieving man who appears to be a decent person. I need some guidance. Should I keep pushing this, or should I leave the police to do their jobs? I just can't shake this nagging feeling that a man is getting away with cold-blooded murder.